Well, today we're going from sort of broadly diagnosis to thinking about ways forward. The first plenary will be political scientists essentially giving their cut on what's been happening and how things can be adapted. We'll have a focus on technology. Is technology the saviour? Technology is often seen as just being a disruptor and a bit of a nuisance, but clearly it's a wonderful opportunity, and we'll hear from people who are well qualified to talk about that. We'll have a session, breakout sessions on sectoral perspectives on what's going on, including one on cities, and there was a fair bit of talk yesterday, including in the big picture session, about the relative significance of what's going on in cities in our countries. So we have a great lineup in all of those sessions. The final session is quite important in terms of what does all this mean for you as public servants, as public sector managers, and that'll be a Chatham House session to facilitate a free and frank discussion from very senior public servants who for some reason don't always like to appear in screaming headlines. So we all look forward to that. I just remind you again that about the evaluations. If you respond to those emails and let us know about that, we'd be very, very grateful, and you might win an iPad. So there you go. So with all of that, thanks again for your attendance, and I'll hand over to Catherine Haddon, Anne Tiernan, and John Johansson for Plenary 6. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary, and good morning, everyone. Congratulations on being here nice and early. We'll look askance at people coming in a little bit late. Obviously, always good on day 2 to start off with a nice, robust, lively debate, and I'm hoping that that's what we'll have today. I'm sure it will be. When you're talking about all of these issues, hyper-governments and so forth, political complexity is too often the elephant in the room. The governing relationship between administrators and politicians is obviously crucial and unique to this particular sector, and too often is the elephant in the room when we're talking about issues of how to govern. So we have 2 experts here today to talk about politics and what's going on at the moment. First of all, we'll have Anne Tiernan from Griffith University, who will talk about the Australian picture and what's going on in this country. And then John Johansson of Victoria University will talk not only about New Zealand, but actually looking a bit more broadly at what's going on in the rest of the world. So without further ado, because I want to get right into this, please join me in welcoming Anne to the stage.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks, ANZSOG, for the invitation. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Look, experience of the past few years has been such that every time you think the political situation can't get any more febrile or volatile, your expectations are confounded. Political awareness has never been more critical a skill for public servants to develop, and in a sense it's never required as much time and attention just to keep up. Now, I've written a lot about the growing professionalisation, adversarialism and partisanship of politics and its impact on the work of governing for about 15 years. Research I've done with my colleague Rod Rhodes has highlighted the cumulative impact of 40 years of almost constant public sector reform on the craft and capacity of the public service, the quality of advice and support that's available to political leaders, and the institutional memory of the Prime Ministership in particular, and of our system of government more broadly. And I think there's broad agreement, as we've discussed and as the theme of this conference kind of suggests, about the damage wrought by the growing tribalism and hyper-partisanship of our politics, particularly in this country. Journalist Paul Kelly has, decried, as we heard yesterday, the political crisis engulfing our nation's political culture. Laura Tingle, who I think is one of the best journalists in the gallery, her quarterly essay, Political Amnesia, and her earlier one, Great Expectations, captured really well some of the drivers of political discontent in Australian politics, and our system's apparent incapacity to deal with it. More recently, Peter Varghese' excellent valedictory speech highlighted the loss of capacity for deep policy thinking and the impact of successive, as he describes them, often evangelical efforts to transform the public service. So I've argued, and I'll do so again today, perhaps more stridently, that we've spent much too long focusing on the non-partisan side of the relationship between ministers and career officials. And in fact, we've given too little attention to politics and the behaviour of the vastly expanded political class. Here I mean politicians, their staff, and the political parties who produce them. This is an international problem. And despite having driven successive waves of reform, ministers have been conspicuously absent from reviews and inquiries into the performance of the public service, despite the leadership roles that they exercise with support from and ideally in partnership with the public service. Now, of course, legendary Mandarin Arthur Tang noted as much in his 1981 Garran oration, reflecting on the Royal Commission into Australian Government Administration that explicitly excluded ministers. Chris Pollitt and Geert Buchert, who will be known to some of you, argue similarly the need to review ministers remaining the no-go zone of public service reform. So I think it's high time we focus on the demand side, the elected side of the governing marriage. And despite the often heroic efforts of senior officials to manage what we scholars call the dilemmas and the puzzles created by successive waves of reform, and particularly the political management reforms, I think it's increasingly untenable to ignore the disregard that some members of the political class show for the rules of the game, the traditions and conventions that guide our system of governance. So I should probably explain how I got to here in terms of my thinking about this situation. I've done a lot of academic work about this, of course, including a comparative study of Westminster Central Executives that I'm working on with Rod Rhodes at the moment. I have a lot of contact in the course of my work with ministers, ministerial staffers and officials in Commonwealth and subnational jurisdictions. Over time, it's really struck me the divergence between the theory, how it's supposed to work, and the practice, how it really does, has become increasingly pronounced. And you really hear that in teaching very much. So in 2014, in an effort to understand the nature of this deep-seated political malaise that seemed to be gripping Australia, I collaborated with founding editor of Griffith Review, Professor Julianne Schultz, to co-edit an issue that we titled Fixing the System. FTS, as we call it, was published in January 2016, and it includes essays and reportage from some of the country's best political analysts and thinkers, all of whom tried to come to terms in different ways with the question of what's wrong with our politics. Now, fixing the system has attracted considerable interest, and from being a bit worried late last year before it went to print that we might have missed the moment, it really seems to have struck a chord. The issue went to print in late November, which seems a long time ago, but for those of you, it's kind of worth recalling. This was when Malcolm Turnbull's popularity was at record highs, following his successful defeat of Tony Abbott for the Prime Ministership in September, before the Trump and Sanders insurgencies gripped the US presidential primaries, and well before the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom, that has forced political pundits like me to concede they know nothing about contemporary politics and are absolutely incapable of predicting what's going to happen next. But it was after the bitter and divisive minority parliament of 2010 to 13. Tony Abbott had won a resounding election victory but was struggling to make the transition from campaigning to governing, and we all know now not what happened next. One-term governments had been defeated in Victoria and in November 2014 and in Queensland in January 2015. Volatility, the commentators told us, was the new normal. So the prevailing environment of complexity and volatility is really familiar to members of the ANZSOG network. Its drivers have been extensively canvassed, both in John's excellent background paper and in conference sessions yesterday. The forces and pressures of change, I think, are taking on particular characteristics right now. But for the most part, they've got a few unusual symptoms that we can talk about, but, I think everybody intellectually understands the impact and implications for the business of governing. What's more difficult, I think, is to get beyond diagnosis and description to the question posed by internationally renowned professor of medicine and pioneer of mindfulness-based stress reduction, John Kabat-Zinn. Now what? As indicated earlier, which I think mindfulness is a very good thing to use in your contemplation of contemporary politics, understandably, a focus on politics makes public servants really nervous. But academics and commentators have a lot more licence, so let me use it. In my Griffith Review essay, I outline the structural factors that I consider to be responsible for recent political failures and the persistent incapacity of the political class to learn from experience. Nothing in the period since has done anything to shake my conviction about the validity of that analysis. I had a moment yesterday when I felt almost completely vindicated. Everything was grist for my analytical mill, and it was quite intoxicating, I have to confess. I had a moment and a promised temporary insight into the mind of Andrew Bolt. However, Briefly, the essay identifies structural factors at 2 levels that inhibit the capacity for learning by political partisans. And I think the first is in the pathway to attaining government. This encompasses the career backgrounds and experiences of political leaders and their now many more numerous fellow travellers, the nature of opposition, how transitions of government are managed. The second impediment is embedded in what we've been talking quite a lot about, the hybrid advisory model that has evolved to support them. It deprives them of institutional memory, as we've discussed quite a bit, but also of the capacity to learn. At the same time, it enables, or at least it doesn't inhibit, a leader like Tony Abbott, Campbell Newman or Kevin Rudd from developing relatively insular and self-reinforcing networks of advice and support until inevitably the party room revolts. Now, recent experience encourages me to add a third structural factor that is or may be becoming intrinsic to contemporary politics. And this is the rise of extremists and factional hacks within political parties whose only raison d'etre is to gain and maintain power. Now, it might be too soon to assert this, but I think the era of leader predominance that led to some people to sort of talk about a presidentialisation thesis might actually have passed. How else can we explain the constraints on, and indeed the extraordinary weakness of leaders like Malcolm Turnbull and David Cameron, whose primary opponents are internal? Winning an election, albeit narrowly in Turnbull's case, conferred none of the authority that being an election winner used to on prime ministers. Quite interesting. So reforming the political parties, pre-selection processes, the hollowing out of their capacity for ideas generation and policy development that Stephen loosely described so well yesterday, is the rational response, I think, to the fact that 22% of Australians voted for someone other than the major parties on the 2nd of July. But we know from bitter experience how stubbornly power brokers on both sides resist efforts to reform and to democratise their processes. The public service has no capacity to influence this. But it does need to understand its implications and the consequences for public administration. The cover story of the current issue of The Atlantic magazine, formerly The Atlantic Monthly, has a cover story by Jonathan Raunch. It's entitled "How American Politics Went Insane." It's a depressing but weirdly compelling meditation on the crisis of legitimacy that's playing out in this most unedifying of US presidential contests. Let me share with you one of my favourite quotes. In their various ways, Trump, Cruz and Sanders are demonstrating a new principle. The political parties no longer have either intelligible boundaries or enforceable norms, and as a result, renegade political behaviour pays. Trump, however, didn't cause the chaos. The chaos caused Trump. What we are seeing is not a temporary spasm of chaos, but a chaos syndrome. Chaos syndrome is a chronic decline in the political system's capacity for self-organisation. It begins with the weakening of the institutions and brokers, political parties, career politicians and congressional leaders and committees that have historically held politicians accountable to one another and prevented everyone in the system from pursuing naked self-interest all the time. As these intermediaries' influence fades, politicians, activists and voters all become more individualistic and unaccountable. The system atomises. Chaos becomes the new normal, both in campaigns and in government itself. Like many disorders, chaos syndrome is self-reinforcing. It causes governmental dysfunction, which fuels public anger, which incites political disruption, which causes yet more governmental dysfunction. Now, intriguingly, Raunch laments these political insurgents' lack of respect for the unwritten aspects of America's constitution, conventions as they've been known in our system. These are the traditions and norms, the beliefs and practices that provide the framework for governance. They endured because they were respected. All sides of politics recognised and accepted their legitimacy and their value. Now, I found local resonance in Raunch's analysis. I'm not suggesting Australia's at a comparable point, but the volatility of our politics is a cause for concern, as is the frankly, at times, flagrant disregard that some members of the political class show for the traditions and conventions of Westminster governance. Among a long list of possibilities of these, I include the conventions of cabinet confidentiality, long forgotten in parts of Parliament House, Canberra, collective responsibility, the merit principle, the caretaker conventions, and Westminster traditions of treating the opposition as an executive in waiting and part of the regime, as Chris Eichbaum reminded us yesterday. I've watched these being selectively trashed by people from both sides of politics at all levels of Australian government. And so you have to ask yourself, is it willful or is it ignorant? It's hard to say, actually, in some cases, and we can run through some of them. But I associate it with the rise of career politics, the demise of the parliamentary apprenticeship, and a more distant relationship between political professionals and the career officials who our system assumes are available to support them when they take the reins of power. So rules matter, institutions matter. Respect for the rules of the game, the traditions and conventions is what's enabled our system of government to evolve and adapt over time. But I think the inexorable diminution of respect for those rules accounts for many of the anxieties of Australian democracy that are playing out in recent election results. American political scientist Hugh Heclo, in a fabulous book called On Institutional Thinking, defines institutional thinking in terms of this respect for the rules and traditions of something that's bigger than ourselves, something that will go on long after we're gone. Now, Peter Varghese emphasised the importance but also the frailty of institutions in his valedictory speech. He reflected, and I'm quoting him here, institutions are fragile living organisms, easily weakened and very hard to repair. Governments forget this to the long-term peril of their nations. And I think he's so right. An expert, professional and neutral career public service remains a defining feature of Westminster-style governance. And we know from history and from the searing experience of the past decade how critical that stewardship role remains for long-term policy making, for our democracy and for public confidence in our political institutions and processes. But the research suggests there's no agreement on either the stewardship role of the public service or what now constitutes a proper relationship between ministers and the public service. This is a live debate in the UK, as Catherine has talked about, where senior civil servants have identified the relationship with ministers as the unresolved constitutional question, the elephant in the room. Rod and my research on central executives in Westminster systems has highlighted kind of 5 analytic themes that you just might find interesting that are common across the 6 jurisdictions under study. They include problems of fragmentation and coordination, which is arguably more acute at the subnational level because states are responsible for service delivery. A tendency to play reactive politics and issues management, which undermines coherence and efforts to focus on key priorities. The primacy of coping and survival in the calculus of political administrative elites. A tendency for a besieged leader to rely on a diminishing circle of close advisors who, by virtue of their close relationship with and loyalty to the leader, are unable or unwilling to offer alternative advice. And the 5th and maybe most surprising thing and concerning thing for many of the people in this room is that the courts that surround ministers no longer regard the public service as central or essential to decision making. And that's not just an Australian phenomenon. We found that in other jurisdictions as well. Each of these presents a challenge to Westminster norms. None of them, though, is within the province of the public service to influence. Instead, we need to focus our energy and attention on persuading a new generation of political leaders and those who support them of the enduring value of a professional public service. We need to focus on politics, on considering whether and the ways by which the currently self-defeating model might be rehabilitated. Thank you.